Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the final shir in this series on Masechet Sotah with Rabbi Avie Walfish. This class, of course, is part of Drisha's um, Rifka Rosenwein Zetzel Mishnah Division and sponsored in the memory of Rifka Rosenwein. Um, and yeah, I have invited everyone to join as a panelist. That means that we'll get to see your face if you choose, and you'll be able to unmute to ask questions when we pause for those. Otherwise, you can put any questions you have in the chat here on Zoom or on Facebook Live, and I'll make sure that they get to Rabbi Walfish. That's all for me.
Okay, thank you, Maxine. Erev Tov to all. Okay, so we are nearing the end of Masechet Sotah, actually part of chapter 9 of Masechet Sotah that is not part of this week's schedule, but we'll be doing our finishing up of Masechet Sotah next week. You'll be completing Sotah and starting Gitin with somebody else. So just review some of what we discussed last time. We saw the first 6 chapters of Masechet Sotah are about the title, okay, the topic that's in the title of the tractate. It's about the Sotah. The first 3 chapters give you the narrative. 4th chapter starts really with the discussion of which women are and are not subject to it. And there's a completion to that in chapters 5 and 6. Chapter 6 also continues with cases where you do and do not have the Sotah, but as we saw, chapter 6 really rounds out the entire subject of Sotah, focusing very much on testimony, okay, which is the subject that opened the tractate. Okay, we open with kinui and stira, the admonition that has to be administered by the husband to the wife in front of witnesses, and the stira, the seclusion that also has to be done in front of witnesses, and that's what starts the whole process going. And now in chapter 6, the focus is on the kind of testimony that will shunt aside the whole Sotah procedure. Okay, they talk about the first testimony, the Edut Rishonah, the Edut Achrona, comparing the kinds of testimony that were described at the beginning of chapter 1 with the kind of testimony that we're talking about here in chapter 6. So that really wraps up the whole subject. So the first 3 chapters are the main body of the discussion. Chapter 4 and chapter 6 are kind of appendices to that. Chapter 5 stands out by itself, and we'll be getting back to that in a bit. But first, let's review something else that we discussed towards the end of last class, and we'll be developing more this week, and that is the new topic that starts with chapter 7. So basically, Tractate Sotah has a 3, 3, and 3 division. 3 chapters are the basic narrative, the main body of the discussion of Sotah. 3 chapters of appendices, that's 4 and 6. And as we'll see, just the very beginning of 5, but that's the basic character of chapters 4, 5, and 6. Okay, is appendices to the main subject. So that's 3 and 3. That, okay, chapter 6, closing the circle, envelope structure, okay, which concludes the main body of Tractate Sotah. Chapter 7 opens a discussion of language. What things have to be done specifically in Lashon HaKodesh, the language of the sacred, okay, which we would say is Hebrew, but it has a more resonance in the term Lashon HaKodesh. It's the language of sanctity. Okay, so certain performances must be done only in Lashon HaKodesh. That's starting with Mishnah 2 of chapter 7. Chapter 7 opens with, and these things can be said, according to manuscript versions, Bilshonam, in their language, probably meaning the language of whoever recites it. And in our printed versions of the Mishnah, you have that right up here on your screen, B'chol Lashon, in any language. And the first thing on the list is Parashat Sotah. And then several other things as well. As we saw last week, unlike what many scholars basically uncritically assumed, which is that when you have a digression, when the Mishnah digresses from its main topic, okay, it's usually in order to bring in things that are related associatively. Okay, so usually, assume the scholars, you have a unit. Remember, the Mishnah is compiled from pre-existing units that were developed, okay, were formulated and arranged in preliminary arrangements in the several generations leading up to the final redaction of the Mishnah by Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi around 200 CE. So in one or another of these preliminary arrangements, you had these Mishnayot. You had the Mishnah of these things can be said in any language, as opposed to these things that must be said specifically in Lashon HaKodesh. And since the this unit opened with Parashat Sotah, that was the first thing on the list, so therefore they wanted to bring it in Tractate Sotah. This was a relevant point about Tractate Sotah, about the Sotah procedure, that the redactor of Tractate Sotah wanted there, and scholars explain, since it's oral literature, and oral literature, once memorized, is very hard to change. So once people had memorized Elu Nemarin, Bilshonam, Parashat Sotah, Vidui Maser, da. So if they decided to just say Parashat Sotah Nemeret B'chol Lashon and move on, that would be confusing. So instead, you bring the whole unit. And in this case, the whole unit amounts to the better part of 3 chapters of the Mishnah. All of Perek Zayin, all of Perek Chet, and let's call it the first half of Perek Tet. That's the unit that gets schlepped in to Masechet Sotah because the unit happens to open with Parashat Sotah. What we saw last time, okay, there's a big topic, like most topics we discuss, that really deserve a lot more time than we can devote to them. But what we briefly saw last time is that actually that's a very questionable theory, and what seems indicated when you look at things more deeply and more critically is the opposite. Okay, the redactor of Tractate Sotah was keenly interested in a lot of the materials included in the things that are said in any language like the Sotah, and actually seems to have been even more keenly interested in the things that must be said specifically in the Lashon HaKodesh. Those things are vital to the interests and concerns of the redactor of Tractate Sotah. Okay, and so in order to work this into Tractate Sotah, he put at the beginning of the list Parashat Sotah. The first of the things that he's going to list that can be recited in any language is Parashat Sotah. But that's at the beginning of the list because he wanted this whole unit in Tractate Sotah and not the opposite. Now, of course, one of the advantages, one of the consequences of looking at it this way, rather than the way that scholars have traditionally looked at it, is scholars are basically explaining, they're giving a causal explanation for what caused this to be here. But if you ask one of these scholars, does the recitation of the passage over the first fruits, over Bikurim, does that add anything to our understanding of the ideas, the major ideas of Tractate Sotah? The answer would be no. That's just there for technical reasons. Since he wanted to bring in the very first unit, and since you can't break up units because that confuses the people who have memorized things, okay, so you had everything there. So we have a whole discussion of the tribes on Har Grizim and Har Eval. And in chapter 8, we'll have a whole discussion of warfare, okay, and the anointed priest who gets up to address the people before they go out to battle, and so on. Why is all that there? Well, the redactor had no choice, okay? He had to schlep it in there. Does it have anything to do with Sotah? Not really, but it's there, okay? That's the consequence of, okay, what scholars call the philological method. You explain things based on philological considerations, okay? Okay, you're a redactor and you have certain constraints and you have certain things you have to do. And so sometimes you have no choice but to put in materials that you'd rather, from a content point of view, you'd rather be somewhere else. But what can you do? You have no choice but to put it here. When you view it the way that I'm suggesting, and again, this is not the reason I prefer it. The reason I prefer it is I think they're very strong reasons. We looked last week, for example, at oh no, I don't have it in this week's source sheet, so we'll skip that now. But I'll just remind you, when we compared the list of 7 items in the first Mishnah and 8 items in the second Mishnah, we saw that Parashat Sotah was the odd man, or should we say odd woman out. Okay, it doesn't belong. There are strong parallels between the list of 7 and 7 of the other 8. But the Sotah doesn't really belong there. In the Tosefta, Sotah doesn't appear. Most of the others do. Okay, those are some of the reasons why I think that the common philological explanation is very dubious. Okay, the broader reason, and this is something that if you continue with your Mishnah Yomit, okay, you should really pay attention to whenever you get to one of these units. When you look at these units that are brought in for associative reasons, in many of the cases, you'll see that the placement of the relevant item at the beginning of the list, and it's invariably at the beginning of the list, but in many of those cases, it's very dubious. Just as here, it's dubious. In some cases, it's far more dubious that really belongs at the beginning of the list. Okay, and that again supports the idea that the redactor put it at the beginning of the list in order to serve as a hook in which to hang the whole rest of the unit. But then, of course, and this is, for me, is the key point, okay, once we've adopted that approach, then you have a very important consequence, which is that it's meaningful. The unit is playing a meaningful role in Tractate Sotah. It's not there for technical reasons. It's there for a real reason. Okay, maybe just to illustrate this point a bit, I'll digress for a moment. We're talking about Mishnah digressions, so I hope you'll forgive me a little digression. And we'll talk about literature in general. Okay, many years ago, I read a book that had a profound influence on how I look at poetry, a book by a poet named John Ciardi on how to read poetry. And in the book, he took a
he writes poetry for children.
Yes. Okay, but he analyzed poetry for adults. And he had some very instructive things to say about how poetry gets written and how it should be read. So in one case, he took a very, very famous poem by Robert Frost, Stopping by the Woods on a Snowy Evening, and he asked why, at the end of the poem, does Frost repeat the last line, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. Why is that line repeated? Okay, so, as a good yeshiva bacher, I would look at that question, and I would say, oh, let's look at the deeper meanings of repeating the line. Okay, but Ciardi gave a very different explanation, and he, after all, is a poet. He said the explanation is, if you look at the whole rhyme scheme in the whole poem, you'll see that the last line of each stanza picks up with the rhyme of the next stanza. So Frost boxed himself into a corner because now he's at the end of the poem. So how does he have something that rhymes with the next stanza? There is no next stanza. So his technical solution was to simply repeat the last line. Okay, and that forms closure of the poem. Okay, but now I would ask anyone who has ever read this poem, if it's possible to forget the resonance of this last repeated line, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. I think those are some of the most powerful lines in English poetry. Okay, precisely because of the repetition. This is another way of saying a poet never does something purely for technical reasons. If he does it for a technical reason and it doesn't work in terms of the ideas, the mood, the emotions that the poem is trying to evoke, then he's a very poor poet. Okay, kids will put in a word just for the rhyme. Or sometimes in pop music, you'll have a word at the end of a line that's there just for the rhyme. But if you're a really good poet, then even if you did something for technical reasons, it's got to work. It's got to add something very profound to what you are trying to convey in that poem. It's the same thing, even though Mishnah is not exactly poetry, but as we've seen, Mishnah uses a lot of poetic technique. And in that regard, yes, Mishnah is very much like poetry. If something is done for technical reasons, it's got to work. It's got to add something real. And that's why I think it's very crucially important to deal with this historical question, really, of how and why did Rabbi, when he redacted the Mishnah, put this whole 3-chapter unit into Tractate Sotah? And if the answer is just because, well, he had one detail at the beginning, and once he brought it in, it slept in the whole rest of it, then you're left with something very unsatisfactory. Then you're adding a line to the poem just to preserve the rhyme scheme, and that's it. But if, you want that whole unit there because it adds something very profound to Tractate Sotah, and then the peg on which you hang it is Parshat Sotah opens up the unit, that's much more satisfactory. Then you're not just, a technician. okay, then the redactor is not just the technician, okay, he is working with his materials and using them to shape something, to create something. Of course, the question is what, and we briefly touched on that last class. Let's take a look at the source sheet that I sent out for this week, okay, which overlaps with the source sheet from last week. Okay, we looked last week at the passage in the Torah in Parashat Ki Tavo about the brachot uklalot. We saw that the blessings and curses, okay, we had blessings and curses in Parashat HaShavua that we read yesterday. And the echo of that is the even more developed blessings and curses in Parashat Ki Tavo. And when we look at that, we saw all kinds of themes that are very reminiscent of the Sotah. Okay, we saw that there is an Allah. The Allah is written in a scroll. Okay? Okay, the Allah will cause God to blot out his name, in this case, the name of the transgressor. Okay? All of these are themes that resonate with the Sotah. The Sotah, okay, accepts upon herself an Allah and a klala. Okay? That Allah and klala are written down in a scroll, which is erased. And interestingly, what is erased there is the name. Here, not the name of the transgressor, but the name of God himself is erased into the bitter waters. And we also saw the centrality of the theme of Seter, okay, of something done in secret, in seclusion, like the stira of the Sotah. Okay, let's just develop this a little further by looking at this drasha. Okay, there's a midrash quoted in the Talmud Bavli, okay, on the passage of the brachot uklalot in the Mishnah, and the Bavli reads as follows: Darash Rabbi Yehuda ben Nachmani meturgemanei de Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. So what was his drasha? Kol parasha kula lo nemra ela benoef v'noefet arur ha'ish asher yaseh pesel u'masecha, etc. Okay, so when it says the person who does something idolatrous, so the darshan asks, Ba'arur sagile. All we have to say about the idolatrous person is he is cursed. God will take care of him. No. When it comes to idolatry, we have to be very proactive in eradicating it. It cannot be that when the Torah says, cursed be the person who worships idols, that's not enough. Obviously, there's something else going on here, he says. Elazeh habal ha'ervav oli ben balach levein ovdei kochavim vavad avodat kochavim arin aviv v'imo shel zeh shekach garmulo. Basically, what he does, what this darshan does, is he turns this list of arur into a kind of story, a narrative. It's not just this one is cursed and this one is cursed, this one is cursed. It starts off with this whole list of arayot, of people who have illicit sexual relations. And what is the result of illicit sexual relations? Children who are born not only out of wedlock, but children who are born as mamzerim, who cannot marry into the Jewish people. What will happen to these people? They will end up going outside of the Jewish people and assimilating among the non-Jews, and then they will end up worshiping idols. So basically, what he's saying is that, okay, the Seter here is very much involved with illicit sexual relations. Okay? In other words, the Midrash is drawing a very close connection between the topic of Sotah, which is illicit sexual relations, relations out of wedlock, relations that erode and undermine the Jewish family, and the whole list of curses as to what the Jewish people cannot tolerate. And the Torah already stresses that many of them are done in secret, so we can't really address them. We need to curse these people because God is the only one who can handle them. And that's very similar to the Sotah. The whole procedure of Sotah, which involves bringing her up to the temple to drink the bitter water, is because we can't handle it. We need God to handle it. She has done something in secret, in seclusion, and we don't know what it was. We're very suspicious. We have a pretty good idea, but we don't know. So we cannot address that situation. We need divine intervention to do it. That's why she is cursed. That's why the scroll is erased, in order to invoke the divine involvement that is so necessary to address this kind of intractable situation. And what happens to the Sotah as an individual parallels what happens to Am Yisrael as a community, when among our community there are people who commit secret transgressions, serious transgressions, transgressions that have repercussions that can erode the religious and social fabric of the people, but they're done in secret, in seclusion. We need to curse them. And so we have this public ceremony where these people are cursed. And they're cursed in the name of the book, the holy book in which these curses are written. And we utter those curses about these people. So we can see then this idea that the blessings and curses that are very central in chapter 7 and really in all of chapters 7 through 9, okay, are a kind of expansion, okay, of the Parshat Sotah itself. Parshat Sotah and this procedure are in communication with one another. One of them is doing for a private individual what the other one is doing for the community at large. Okay, and as we saw last time, this passage is important not only because the Mishnah brings it at great length, but because the Mishnah uses that as the model for many of the other cases that must be done in B'Lashon HaKodesh. Since it says V'yanu HaLeviim, the Leviim will raise their voices and utter these curses, and that must be done in Hebrew. So from there we learn that when it says V'yanita v'yamarta lifnei Hashem Elokecha, okay, regarding Mikra Bikurim, or when it says V'yanta v'yamra in the Chalitza procedure, so we learn Aniyah from Aniyah, Gzera Shava. Okay, the word la'anot has a standard meaning, must be Lashon HaKodesh. So that's really the source for so many of the things that have to be done in Lashon HaKodesh. It would appear further, Lashon HaKodesh is the language that must be used when you're talking about a public ceremony. When you're talking about some kind of private ritual, that can be done in any language. And the list in the first Mishnah of chapter 7 seems to be those kinds of cases, the cases that could properly be regarded as private, okay, as private rituals. Okay, this division to public and private is interesting because what seems to be happening in both cases is the Sotah is a private ceremony for a private woman and her relationship with her own husband, but it's done in public. It's made into a public spectacle. And it's done with the involvement of her local court, of the high court in Yerushalayim, of the priest in the temple, with people invited to come and witness the event. In other words, it's a private ritual, but with public repercussions. And in the same way, the blessings and curses are a public ceremony, but addressed to private people. We don't know who those private people are. We're saying, anyone among you who fits this description, we, the public, are cursing you. And so when you look at the two of them, what you really see is a kind of symbiotic relationship between private and public. So yes, the Mishnah divides them and says, there are certain things that in their essence are private, they can be done in any language. There are other things that in their essence are public, they need to be done in Lashon HaKodesh. But the things that are done, at least some of the things that are done in private, have very serious repercussions upon the public, and particularly the Sotah. If the Sotah continues to be a Sotah, then that will have very serious public ramifications. The family will be eroded, and that will in turn erode Jewish peoplehood. Okay, and the public ceremony is addressed to, if there are individuals among us who are undermining our values, then we are cursing them. Okay, so we have this kind of back and forth relationship between them. We have a dividing line that puts each ceremony on one or the other side of it, but the two of them are in communication with one another, because the public and the private, okay, are impacting upon one another in these cases. Okay, so that's one of the reasons why it was important for the redactor of Tractate Sotah to have this whole section here. Okay, a bit later on in our shiur, we'll see an additional reason. You know what? Let's look at that additional reason first, and then we'll come back and look at the other point. Yes.
In
Yes.
front of whom was this done? Was this done in front of women or men? The whole
the Sotah,
ritual. Yeah.
Based on the language of the Mishnah in chapter 1, said anyone who wants to see can come and see. So it sounds like anyone is invited to see, men and women. But there's also a pasuk cited there, v'nosru kol hanashim. So as part of the point of making it a public spectacle is for women to see it as an object lesson. So apparently the real value is for women to see it, but it doesn't seem to be limited to that. Okay, so
I was discussing this with someone. I had always felt that it was sort of hostile to women, and the person I was discussing it with, he said to me that it struck me that it starts out with ruach kin'ah, that he had it in for her. So he said that might be, but there were many instances where she could have turned it around and she persisted. So she did not show herself in the best light either.
Okay, that is correct, and it's a point we've noted along the way. And another point worth noting is Chazal's reinterpretation of ruach kin'ah. Ruach kin'ah, Chazal do not understand as being a spirit of jealousy. They understand kin'ah as being an admonition that she went ahead and ignored. He said to her, I don't want you secluding yourself with this man. and she went and secluded herself with that very man. Okay, so this is, so we're talking about, very strong grounds for suspicion. Okay, and we're talking about something she has really brought upon herself. It's not just, a jealous husband who takes it into his head. I don't know what she's doing. There are people like that in the world. There are husbands like that in the world. And the Torah arguably might have been addressing that kind of a case. So that's certainly not the way the sages of the Mishnah read it. The way they read it is she had to know what consequences she was bringing upon herself. And the Mishnah repeatedly talks about how
She's given
if either
opportunity.
the husband says, you know what, forget about it, I don't want this whole spectacle, let's just end this marriage and get it done with. Or if she says, I'm not going through with this, let's just end this, get it over with, it doesn't happen. Okay, so that is absolutely true. So hostile to women, I think, is, it is certainly not egalitarian, but we will see something that makes it somewhat more egalitarian in a bit. But first, I'd like to look at one of the other reasons why this whole section about language came into Tractate Sotah. Okay, so let's take a look at chapter 8. We already mentioned is devoted entirely to the address, first of all, by the anointed priest, the Mashuach Milchama, then later on by Shotrim, okay, by officers or officials, okay, who address the people before they go into battle. It's a very interesting chapter, but I'm afraid we won't have much time for it. Okay, and then chapter 9 talks about Eglah Rufa. First part of the chapter. The last part is a kind of coda to the entire tractate. Okay, but the first part of chapter 9 is all about Eglah Rufa. Okay, breaking the neck of the heifer, of the young heifer, female calf. Okay, Eglah. Okay, and that is in a case where we know of someone was murdered and we can't find the murderer. Okay, that's the Eglah Rufa. That must be done in Lashon HaKodesh, and that's the subject of the whole first part of chapter 9. And that closes the Mishnah's lengthy discussion of the things that must be done in Lashon HaKodesh. The one thing that I think, again, should be noted is in chapter 7, okay, we'll go back and look at chapter 7. When we look at the list of the cases that must be done B'Lashon HaKodesh, okay, let's look at the end of the list. Here we go. B'Lashon HaKodesh starts with Mikra Bikurim, concludes with Mashuach Milchama B'Shah Shemedaber Al Ha'am. Okay, the priest anointed for war when he addresses it. So that's the last one. Eglah Rufa is the next to the last. So when the Mishnah lists them, Eglah Rufa is next to last. But then we get to chapter 8, and after the priestly blessings and the Parashat HaMelech, the Parashat Kohen Gadol, that are all listed in chapter 7. Chapter 8 is all devoted to the Mashuach Milchama. We skipped over Eglah Rufa. But why did we skip it over? Because we get to Eglah Rufa in chapter 9. The order is flipped. Why? Why is the order flipped? Okay, so there could be different reasons for it, but we're going to focus on one that tells us something very significant and I think very profound about Tractate Sotah. Eglah Rufa is, in a way, very much akin to the Sotah. How so? What do Eglah, Rufa, and Sotah have in common?
Uncertainty.
Exactly. Now, the uncertainty is not exactly the same. In the case of the Sotah, we know who the suspect is. We don't know if she's guilty. In the case of the Eglah Rufa, we know that a murder was committed. We don't know who committed it.
In both
that sense,
cases, there are no witnesses.
Right. In both, right. Now, in the case of Sotah, there are witnesses to the preliminaries, right? There are witnesses to the kinui, to the stira, but there are no witnesses to the act itself. That's what we learned in chapter 6. If there are witnesses to the act, no procedure. All you need is one witness, even though halachically you generally need two witnesses. One witness is enough of a reason for her not to drink, because apparently God will involve himself only when human beings don't know. If there's one witness, you might not be able to establish it to the satisfaction of a court of law in order to punish the perpetrator. But you can't say we don't know. One witness means we know. We know what happened. In order to punish, especially capital punishment, you need stronger proof. You need to know absolutely, not just to know. So God says, if you know, even though you don't know absolutely, I don't get involved. Okay, so I'm out of here. I'm not involving myself in this event. You guys handle it. You can't handle it? Okay, I can't always pull your chestnuts out of the fire. But when you don't know it all, because there are no witnesses whatsoever to the event itself, I'm not talking about the preliminaries, for which there certainly have to be witnesses. The event itself, there are no witnesses. God says, I'm not getting involved. And with Eglah Rufa as well, there can't be witnesses. Let's take a look at the at what the Mishnah has to say about that. Okay, here we go. Okay, Mishnah Chet. Eid echad omer ra'iti et hahoreg, ve'eid echad omer lo ra'ita. Isha omeret ra'iti, v'isha omeret lo ra'ita. Hayu orfin. If you have witnesses who contradict each other, okay, then you will go through with it. Eid echad omer ra'iti, u'shnayim omrim lo ra'ita, hayu orfin. Shnayim omrim ra'inu, ve'eid echad omer lo ra'item, lo hayu orfin. But now, what seems is one witness, let's say you have one witness who said, I saw the murderer, and nobody contradicts him, that would be enough. But if one witness is contradicted by another witness, then we say, okay, that's like having no witnesses. So that is not something that we know. Now, some of you may recall that we had something very similar to that in chapter 6. Here we go. Here we go. Eid omer nitmeit, ve'eid omer lo nitmeit. Same exact situation. One witness says she was defiled by the deed itself. Ve'eid omer lo nitmeit. Isha omeret nitmeit, v'isha omeret lo nitmeit, hayta shotah. Echad omer nitmeit, u'shnayim omrim lo nitmeit, hayta shotah. Shnayim omrim nitmeit, ve'echad omer lo nitmeit, lo hayta shotah. The same list of cases appears regarding the Sotah and the Eglah Rufa. And what both of them say is a single witness is enough to scrap the whole ceremony. A single witness. You don't need more than that. And that in turn raises the question, what if you have a single witness, but he's contradicted by another witness? All the more so if he's contradicted by two witnesses. But also, what if you have two witnesses who say we saw, and then one contradicts? Okay, so then the two overrule the one. Okay, you have that in both cases, but it's all developing this theme of how far do we take this notion of uncertainty? Okay, now, so the Eglah Rufa and the Sotah then seem to have a lot of parallels. Let's note something else that I think is interesting. Sotah has to do with one of the three cardinal areas of Judaism, which is the area of family purity, the area of arayot. Okay? And Eglah Rufa has to do with one of the other two areas, namely murder. What's the third in the trio? The three cardinal sins that you have to give up your life for rather than transgress them.
Avodah Zarah.
Avodah Zarah is the third, right? So here we have two out of the three. They're both described in the Torah as defiling the land, as distancing God from the land and from the people. And these are the two areas where the Torah says, if something dastardly seems to have occurred in one of those two areas, and we're not sure, we don't have the information, then we have a ceremony. And the ceremony brings us before God. And in the case of the Sotah, the ceremony will either exculpate the woman and she's free to go back to her husband, or will convict the woman and lead to her death. Right? That's what happens in the Sotah ceremony. And in the Eglah Rufa ceremony, it's a ceremony of expiation. The community expiates this murder. Normally, what does the Torah say? How can you expiate a murder? There's a pasuk in the Torah that says in Parshat Mas'eh, the end of Bamidbar, there's really only one way to expiate a murder, and that is to bring the murderer to justice. Other than that, you can't expiate a murder. We can't bring the murderer to justice, and so we do a second best. We expiate the murder by performing this ceremony, the Eglah Rufa ceremony. These are both, by the way, very unusual ceremonies, okay, with very unusual consequences, and both of them are to cope with a situation in which a cardinal sin seems to have been committed in one of these two cardinal areas of Jewish law, okay, and we don't have the knowledge, and so we have to involve God.
They're both public spectacles.
They're both public spectacles, and both of them also involve a lot of the same players. Okay, let's take a look. Okay, who are the players when it comes to the Eglah Rufa? Okay, so the first thing is v'yatzu zekenecha v'shoftecha shlosha mibeit din hagadol. 3 of the elders from the high court in Yerushalayim have to go and measure from the heifer, not from the heifer, measure from the body to the nearest cities. And then when they discover which city is closer, what do? Okay, so then nifteru ziknei Yerushalayim v'alchu lahem. Okay, the elders of Yerushalayim, okay, depart, and ziknei otah ha'ir, okay, the elders of that particular town, they're the ones who bring the Eglah Arufa. This remind you anything about the Sotah? Before whom does the husband bring the Sotah, according to the Mishnah?
The Beis Din of the city.
The Beit Din of the city. And the Beit Din of the city then send two Talmidei Chachamim to accompany the husband and the wife to the Beit Din in Yerushalayim. Right? There are also Kohanim involved in the Eglah Arufa, which is, which is also reminiscent, of course, of the Sotah. So here, let's take a look at the source sheet, okay, and we'll see this in a in a more systematic fashion. Here are parallels between the Eglah Arufa and the Sotah. We started with Eid Omer Ra'iti and Eid Omer Nitmeit, okay, chapter 9 and chapter 6. 3 from the Beit Din Gadol, they bring them to Beit Din Gadol, okay, the Ziknei Otah Ha'ir, the Beit Din of the city, okay. Interestingly, the husband and the wife are accompanied up to the high court, and as part of the Eglah Arufa ceremony, they proclaim, "We did not fail to accompany the victim." In other words, if he goes out, into the, into the uncivilized area between two cities, so then we are effectively abandoning him to his fate. If a murderer finds him, we are responsible. There's no, we accompanied him. We didn't just send him out, we accompanied him. So any potential murderer should have realized someone has his back. Someone cares for him. We did what we could to save him. Okay? The Kohanim say, atone for your people. The Kohen, of course, is the one who administers the Sotah waters. There's also a Mishnah about what happens if we get the information in the middle of the ceremony. Up until which point will we go through with, will we cancel the ceremony? And after which point we'll say we're going to go through with it anyway. We had a similar Mishnah in chapter 3 about the Sotah, and so on. Okay, you can take it even further. But there's another very interesting connection. Let's first of all see it in the text of the Mishnah. Okay. Okay, and this is a kind of appendix. We're already beginning the appendix to Tractate Sotah. Now we conclude the Eglah Arufa case by saying, Misherabu haratzchanim batla Eglah Arufa. From the time when murderers proliferated, the ritual of the heifer, whose neck is broken, was nullified. And the Mishnah continues and says, Misherabu hamina'afim pasku amayim hamarim. Okay, when adulterers proliferated, the performance of the bitter waters was nullified. Notice how the Mishnah brings the two of them together. The conclusion, the appendix to the Eglah Arufa. When did this procedure end? when there were so many murderers, we said, okay, forget it. We can't atone for all the murders anymore. So forget the Eglah Arufah ceremony. And similarly, when adulterers proliferated, we canceled the Sotah procedure. So here the Mishnah is really almost explicitly comparing the two. So these two cases frame the tractate. That's why Eglah Arufah is placed last. That's why the order is flipped. Mashuach Milchama goes into chapter 8, so that Eglah Arufah and Sotah will frame the tractate to point up the parallels between Eglah Arufah and Sotah. And as we've seen, that gives us a much more profound understanding of both of these rituals. They're both rituals for coping with the most serious cardinal transgressions when human beings don't know, when we're helpless to deal with them the way the society is supposed to deal with them. So the Torah provided Am Yisrael with ways of coping in these situations. Sotah here, Eglah Arufah there. But one final point, and this will finally bring us back to chapter 5. Okay, so let's go back to chapter 5. Okay, I promised you something that will make the Sotah procedure a little more egalitarian, not quite, but somewhat more. Keshem shamayim bodkin ota, kachamayim bodkim oto. The water evaluates her fidelity, but also his, her paramour, right? And the same way she is prohibited to her husband as long as she is Sotah, she is prohibited to her paramour as well. Okay, so we have this kind of symmetry. But as we saw last week, the Mishnah then goes into a whole series of drashot, mostly by Rabbi Akiva, who we know from other sources as having been an amazingly creative and bold exegete, homiletical exegete of the Torah. Okay, used some very striking and many, including many of his colleagues, thought forced ways of reading the text of the Torah in order to come up with new ideas. And this chapter seems to be a celebration of those drashot. Now, the interesting thing is, these drashot seem to have nothing whatsoever to do with Sotah. Okay, one of them has to do with the defiling characteristics of an earthenware vessel. Okay, the second one has to do with the measuring from outside of a city. Okay, the Torah says the end of Bamidbar that a Levitical city has a perimeter of 1,000 cubits, but it also says 2,000. So Rabbi Akiva tries to reconcile those and explain what we mean by the perimeter of a city. Then Rabbi Akiva has a drasha about how Am Yisrael sang their song of praise. Okay, sang their song of praise upon the splitting of the Red Sea. And finally, a drasha by the next generation, Rabbi Yoshua ben Hyrcanus, who had a drasha about whether Eov served God out of love or out of fear. Okay, now, this seems to be very far-flung, okay? But the interesting thing is, if you take a closer look, then you can see that there are, again, a lot of parallels between this list of drashot and other chapters in Tractate Sotah. Some of them are reminiscent of the Sotah procedure, such as defiling. Okay, defilement reminds us that the Sotah is a form of defilement. Torah calls her Tme'ah, and the Mishnah calls her Tme'ah. Okay, also, she drinks her bitter waters from a clay cup. Okay, that's that's the vessel from which she drinks the bitter water. It's like the clay cup that's described in this Mishnah. Rabbi Yoshua reacts to this Mishnah and says, "Who will remove the dust from your eyes?" Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai was dead and buried at that point. Who will remove the dust from your eyes? And that reminds us about how the Sotah is revealed and how the bitter waters involve dust. So you see, this Mishnah throws us back to some of the details of the Sotah procedure. Let's skip over Mishnah 3 for right now. When we talked about Israel answering after Moshe, how did the Song of the Sea take place? Moshe recited and the people responded. That reminds us of the Leviim reciting the curses and the people respond by saying Amen. And Korin et Shema. Okay, one of the models for how the Israelites responded was like the recitation of Shema. One of the things in the list of things that can be recited in any language is Kriyat Shema. Okay, so we'll suffice with that, except for the middle Mishnah of chapter 5, which is the exact midpoint of Tractate Sotah. 9 chapters, and this is the third of the 5 Mishnayot in the 5th chapter. It's the exact midpoint of the middle chapter. And it talks about measuring from the city. And that reminds us of 2 things that are brought into Tractate Sotah from left field. One of them is the whole section in chapter 1 on measure for measure. Measure there is used metaphorically. Here in chapter 5, measuring is used literally. But where does measuring come up again? In chapter 9.
With the Egla Arufa.
The Egla Arufa, and here again it's literal. You measure to the city. In chapter 5, you measure from the city. These again are mirror images of one another. Chapter 5 has in its middle, you measure from the city to see the perimeter of the city. And in chapter 9, you measure to the city to see which is the closest city, which city needs to take responsibility for expiating this murder. And now let's go back again to chapter 1. Measure for measure, that's metaphorical measurement. But in chapter 1, you also had a city, right? You had the court of the city that has to accompany the woman up to the high court in Yerushalayim. So what do we have at the beginning of the tractate, chapter 1, the end of the tractate, chapter 9, the midpoint, the exact midpoint of the tractate, the middle of chapter 5, you have the theme of measurement. Why? That's the 64, we used to say in my day, $64,000 question. I don't think $64,000 is worth all that much today, but that's the big question. So let me just throw out the following idea, and with that we will conclude our study of Tractate Sotah. I think the idea of the city is playing a very crucial role here, because the city represents the social order. And the social order is represented by measurement. Okay, when you measure, you're expressing control. You're expressing rationality. Things are done in a rational fashion. Okay? You speak in measured tones, right? Measurement is often a metaphor for something that's orderly, not chaotic. Tractate Sotah is about chaos that threatens civilization. Jewish civilization is threatened by disorder. The undermining of the family structure, the Sotah, murder, which undermines the social fabric, okay? And in order to cope with those, we have to reinstitute measurement. So God steps in, measure for measure. When human beings can't measure, God steps in with his form of measurement. That's measure for measure in chapter 1. And in chapter 9, God will expiate the sin, but first we have to measure. You measure from the city to the wilderness. The dead body is found out in the field, out in wilderness. That's why no one knows what happened to him, because he's outside of civilization. You're measuring from the wild lands out there on the highway. Highways then were not like our highways now. Highways were places for highwaymen to waylay people and perhaps murder them. You're measuring from there to the city. You want to get us back into civilization. And then they take the heifer down to a very wild area, a Nachal Eitan, in order to perform the ceremony, in order to go back into civilization. And so I think the measuring theme is very much about how the Torah provides for those acts that can most profoundly undermine the social and spiritual order of Am Yisrael, and how Am Yisrael restores measurement, restores it to civilization, but it's not just civilization, it's also reconciliation with God. It's reconciliation with society and reconciliation with God. So even though there is so much in this tractate that is wild and woolly, but it's all in the interest of bringing everything back into the fold. In order to do that, you need all walks of the society to be involved, from the local court to the high court to the priest in the temple. They all have to be involved. And God himself has to be involved. Okay? But that's what the Torah provides with us for coping with those things that are potentially so explosive, okay, and so subversive to the social and spiritual integrity of our society. That, I would like to submit, is one of the key themes of Tractate Sotah, as reflected more than anything else by this very interesting use in various ways of the terms of measurement at the beginning, middle, and end of the tractate. Thank you all. Enjoyed learning with all of you, and Erev Tov and Chag Sameach.
Thank you very much, Rav Walfish.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Rabbi
you.
Walfish, for that wonderful conclusion. And thank you to everyone who participated. And Sefira Zman is wrapping up, of course, but classes are going to be continuing over the summer. We're going to be beginning again with Masechet Gittin for the Mishnah in Depth with Leora Belinsky, as always, on Sundays at 1 p.m. Eastern, starting June 6th. Thank you.
Thank you.